Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited tonight to be to hear about sleep and how we can have better sleep. I bet all of us in here are very interested in this for probably personal reasons, or at least someone that we know. This is a series called Healthy Living Series. I know some of you have been to our previous talks and hopefully have enjoyed them, and that's why you're back. This is being sponsored by the Graduate Center. The Graduate Center is an entity within the Graduate College of the University of Arizona, and it's an entity that provides resources primarily for graduate students, but also for postdocs and faculty and the general public, and as we are tonight. We're also being sponsored by the Office of Research and Discovery and the School of Mind, Brain, and Behavior, so we want to thank our sponsors for that. Tonight, I'm very excited I just met, in fact, for the first time, Dr. Patricia Haynes, and I've heard wonderful things about her from colleagues on campus, so I know that you're in for a treat. And let me tell you just a little bit about her. She is an associate professor in the health promotion sciences and a licensed clinical psychologist with an expertise in sleep psychology, depression, and anxiety. She got a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Missouri in Columbia, a master's degree in clinical psychology from San Diego State University, that's one of my alma maters too, and a PhD in clinical psychology from the joint doctoral program through San Diego State and UCSD. She did a postdoctoral fellowship here at University of Arizona in the behavioral sleep psychology lab. Her research focuses on how stressful life events affect sleep and daily routine to increase risk for depression, stress-related disorders, and obesity. She's also researching sleep in veterans with PTSD. The overall focus of her research program is in the development and testing of behavioral interventions and health promotion campaigns that have the potential to improve sleep, mental, and physical health. She also partners with Well America and also the Tucson Fire Department to help first responders maintain their mental health and resiliency. So today, Dr. Haynes is here to tell us why sleep matters. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. My goal with our discussion tonight is to try to have a little bit of fun. Sleep has gotten so much more media play than ever before, mostly because it's become what we're calling a new public health epidemic. There's always a new one, right? And this is the new one in the last couple of years, sleep insufficiency or sleep curtailment. So my goal is not to bore you with, don't drink caffeine, don't, you name it, like don't eat 2 hours before bed. And instead, talk a little bit more about what's going on a personal level, kind of think more personally and experientially about our lifestyles and what's happening, okay? So the plan for today's talk is to just give you a quick overview. What is good quality sleep? Why is sleep important? And then spending some time about what stands in your way of achieving good quality and quantity sleep, okay? And then finally, exploring potential sleep solutions, and there are different solutions for different problems. So we're gonna talk about two main problems today, one being just not getting enough sleep, and the second one is insomnia. Okay, so what's normal sleep? It's interesting, if you go into a doctor's office, if they ask you about sleep, and that's kind of a big if, what's the one question they would be most likely to ask?
Are you getting enough sleep?
Are you getting enough sleep? Or how much sleep are you currently getting, right? And generally everything kind of focuses on the amount of sleep we get, and we kind of forget something that I think is much more important, which is what is the type of sleep that you're getting? Do you wake up in the morning feeling rested? Are you getting good quality sleep? Kind of bring that up to say we tend to focus on this number of hours of sleep when really it's more of a secondary. But to get it out of the way, I just wanted to say that there really is no normal. Everybody has their own personal of what they need. The average human need is 8.3 hours. How many people in here are receiving what they would estimate to be 8.3 hours of sleep? 2, 3 maybe? right? I would say, and I always get a couple students who are like on the weekends, right? After a night of 4 or 5 hours, okay? So it's pretty rare nowadays, even though that is our human need, we feel very lucky now if we get 7, okay? So we'll talk about that. The normal time that it takes somebody, and I say normal because everybody's different, is about 10 minutes to fall asleep. Although anything over 30 is when we start to be like, maybe we need to, think about that a little bit more. And then I also just want to say that napping is an occurrence, it is a cultural occurrence, and it generally begins at the beginning and the end of our life. Okay, so that can be another norm that we could consider as well. Slide from the National Sleep Foundation. Again, more of that sleep duration stuff, but whenever we say 8.3 hours, we're always just assuming we're talking about this group over here, right? When there's a lot of other people out there that newborns need 14 to 17 hours, toddlers 11 to 4, my daughter, 9-year-old, needs 9 to 11 hours still, right? We always forget that. Doesn't mean she's getting it, but that's her human need, and she does a pretty good job, actually. And then adults, generally now we think of a range between 7 to 9 hours, and then you'll notice older adults, anyone 65 and older, it's interesting, the duration recommendations are between 7 to 8 hours. It gets older and older to sustain longer sleep. Okay, just a brief reminder. I think we've all heard of different types of sleep stages and the different types of sleep we get. So what are the sleep stages? Well, let's start first with let me talk about how we measure this. So we have these instruments called a polysomnography, which is the main way we measure sleep. It involves attaching electrodes to our brain, and oftentimes it involves attaching leads to other parts of our body, including our legs to see what's happening with our legs, or our face to see how much movement we have. You can also look at our breathing. And from that, we've been able to estimate what is happening to the brain under different conditions. And one condition we can look at is just when you're awake. And what you're going to notice, what our brain is typically doing when we're awake, and hopefully we'll maintain doing this throughout this talk, is high frequency waves. There are like lots of little lines, and it's low amplitude. So you're going to see the waves are lower in length. Okay? When we start to get more relaxed, you're going to start to see that those waves kind of get a little bit higher amplitude. We go into that alpha wave state, more relaxed state. Okay, so what happens when we fall asleep now? We're going to see that we go into sleep stage 1, right? And sort of the activity from awake reduces. Going into stage 2, we start to see these characteristic things called sleep spindles. We get a little more dense. We get these kind of movements and these things called K complexes. I don't know if that would be considered one, but we start to see events that are, okay, this person's in stage 2. And then we get into what I'm going to together, because we don't really distinguish these anymore, called slow wave sleep, okay, which is stage 3 and 4. Now we just call it N3. And this would be when we have higher amplitude, lower frequency waves. Okay, so it looks pretty different than if you look up here at awake. And then there's the sleep that everybody talks about, kind of the popular sleep. We call it rapid eye movement sleep. And if you're going to look at this type of sleep, what does it look most like of all these other stages up here? Anybody? What?
It looks like they're all together.
Yeah, it does. And I would say, doesn't it look most like you're awake? Yeah. So REM sleep actually sometimes is very hard when we score sleep records to know, is this person actually awake or are they in REM? And the only way that we can tell the difference is by looking at motor movement. In REM sleep, our body, we have muscle atonia, our body completely stops moving, which is a good thing, because if our body didn't stop moving, what would happen? We'd be exhausted and we'd start acting out our dreams, right? So REM, and there is actually a disorder called REM behavior disorder. I'm sure you guys have heard about this in the popular media, right? Where we lose muscle atonia during REM sleep and we go and act out our dreams, okay? So just an interesting side note. Okay, so why do we need all these stages? Like, why do we need REM sleep? Why do our eyes do this crazy thing when we dream? Why do we need slow wave sleep? Why does it differ than stage 2? I'm going to tell you, no one really knows, okay? I mean, but lots of people have debated, and more we know that REM sleep is associated with emotional processing, gathering and synthesizing lots of information, figuring out what's the most important, and storing it in our brain. Okay? More and more we're finding that, but we need more information still. It's interesting because I think sometimes I ask that question and people say REM sleep is what makes you feel relaxed or what makes you feel refreshed in the morning. And actually that's not true. There's another type of sleep that I would call the goods of sleep. This is the sleep that helps you feel relaxed, refreshed in the morning, and that would be the slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep is that deep level sleep. Okay? And then if you look at it from like, how much do we get of these different types of sleeps throughout our night, you're going to see something really interesting. So these bars here, okay, so let me walk you through a stage hypnogram. What happens at the beginning of the night is we start out awake, and we go down from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 and 4, that's slow wave sleep, and then we go right back up and we hit our first REM cycle about 90 minutes after we first go to sleep. And we repeat the same thing every 90 minutes, right? Throughout the night when we wake up about 8 in the morning. Okay, let's say we went to bed at midnight, we wake up at 8 in the morning, or 8 hours later, whenever you went to sleep. Okay, so one of the things that I want you to notice is what happens to REM over the course of the night. Do we get more at the end of the night or more at the beginning of the night? End of the night. We get much more at the end of the night. So one of the things you might notice is you wake up in the morning and you remember that you had a dream, right? And that's usually because it's going to be more likely that you're waking up in the morning and actually remembering a dream because it's more likely that you will have had REM in the morning. So some gentleman asked me about nightmares, and oftentimes, not all the time, oftentimes people are more likely to remember their nightmares because they're waking up during REM sleep. And usually it's going to happen in the later part of the night than 2 hours after you went to bed. Because 2 hours after you went to bed, what are you experiencing more of? That deep sleep, right? So that's kind of why I say it's the goods of sleep. I think that we have an evolutionary advantage that we put the refreshing, the deep sleep early in the night to a certain extent, because that is the key piece in helping us feel refreshed and recovered. I don't know how yet. I don't think the literature is entirely clear on that. Okay, need more work there. Okay, so sleep is one thing, but sleep is only one biological function that happens in a rhythmic pattern every day. Okay, so there's this thing called circadian rhythms, which are rhythms that happen on a 24-hour cycle, and it's regulated by this mechanism in our brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And it's interesting, and this is one of the reasons I got into sleep. I find it fascinating that we are programmed to time with the external world all through light and dark, all through the sun. We've all adapted, almost everything on Earth has adapted to light, dark. And one of the things that's interesting is that sleep is only one of them. Temperature works on a 24-hour cycle, melatonin, you name a physiological function, and it likely works on a 24-hour cycle. Now, in addition, sleep works on a homeostatic cycle. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, okay, if you think about yourself and you want to go, you wake up at 8 in the morning and you decide to go back to bed at 10 in the morning, how easy would that be?
Very easy.
Yeah, for you. But for anybody else, right? It's hard because it's only 2 hours later and you just had a full night's sleep, right? But so what we call that is that a homeostatic. If you wake up in the morning, your drive to sleep is very low. But gradually your drive to sleep builds across the course of the day until you get to a cut point, at which case it goes back down. So there's a homeostat there. Okay, so that's your drive for sleep. So it's a lot easier to fall asleep at 10 p.m. than it would to be to fall asleep at 10 a.m. for most people who are on a typical day-night schedule. There's this other process called a circadian rhythm, and it happens at all different times. But I want to bring it together because sometimes, because generally in most people they work together. So what happens, so let's just choose a typical circadian measure like temperature. So what happens throughout the course of the day in general, I mean there are dips here and there, is that our temperature, right before we wake up, we're kind of cold, and then suddenly we get very warm. In fact, it might even start before we wake up. Our temperature starts to rise gradually over the course of the day. We get into lunch, we have a little post-lunch dip in our temperature cycle, we're a little bit chillier, but we gradually warm up until right before we go to bed, at which point our temperature starts to plummet, And that temperature plummeting, you'll see that dramatic decline in temperature usually occurs about the time that sleep onset is the highest, right? And then we go to sleep. Now, during the course of sleep, our temperature continues to plummet until it starts to rise. And about the time that it's beginning to rise, we awaken. Okay? So they work together. Now, sometimes, and this is why I wanted to bring this up, especially if I'm giving a talk to college students, is sometimes they don't work together. Sometimes one cycle, for instance, can delay itself a little bit. The circadian rhythm can. And adolescents or college students are a great example of this, right? So does anybody in this room have you or do you have an adolescent in your midst? No? Okay, so guess what time, let me give you another question. If you had to reckon a guess on what the median time for a U of A college freshman to go to bed is, what do you think? 3 a.m.? Is that what someone said? Yeah. Well, last time I checked, it was 2:10 a.m. Okay? So the idea being that, but here's the thing, is if you ask them to go to bed at midnight, guess what happens? They might not be able to sleep because their biological clock has actually, the biological clock is actually advanced forward. Okay, anybody here been to Green Valley? Yes. Have you ever tried to go out to eat at Green Valley at 9 o'clock? Yeah. If so, I wouldn't recommend because there's not that many places open. And why do you think that is? Green Valley is a retirement community. And when we get older, our circadian rhythm actually goes the other way. It advances, right? In fact, if you go to the golf course at 4 a.m. in Green Valley, you might not be the first person on the course. Okay, everybody has advanced forward. So it's another good example. And it doesn't cause problems. People are retired. They live their lives that way. But it's a good example of when things don't work together. Yeah, question?
Can those sorts of shifts happen because of habituation, or is this always based on your age?
Well, that's a great question. The question is, can it happen because of habituation, or is it based on your age? So there are developmental differences. Like younger people tend to be delayed, older people tend to be advanced. But there are also a lot of individual differences. In fact, we know that it's often very genetic, that morning larks tend to kind of have parents who are morning larks. Night owls tend to have parents that are night owls. There's strong evidence that way. And people kind of naturally have a preference, one way or the other. So I wouldn't say the behavior drives it as much as what the rhythm is driving, and that then leads to the behavior. Great question. Okay. All right, so this was the average bedtimes. I gave you the U of A college student, but if you're looking at 18 to 29 years old, you'll see that the average bedtime is 12. This is the time on the weekend, right? And this is the time on a weeknight. So weeknight time, 11:52 p.m., weekend time, 12:38. And that's including a bunch of people, remember, between the ages of 23 and 29, right? So I bet if we just looked at 18, 17-year-olds, it might be a little even later. And then you'll see that it gradually goes down. Over time. Now, one of the things I want to point out, why would they separate it off between weekend and weekday, right? Well, the reason is because if you've ever been really tired and gone to work and kind of chronically stayed up late, you'll know that in the morning you have to get up for work or school regardless of the reason. And so that leads to what we call sleep debt, right? So if you're going to bed at midnight and you have to get up every morning at 6:30 to get to work on time, how do you feel on Friday? Tired, right? You feel tired, you feel exhausted. So on the weekends, you're going to stay up to your predisposition, sleep in as late as possible until you have to start it all over again on Monday. So that's why they're looking at both. Okay, so just a little bit. I kind of started off the talk talking about how they've now termed insufficient sleep as a public health epidemic. Looking at the number of people who report less than 7 hours of sleep, if we look at Arizona, 67 to 68% of people, right? I was just released this was a national mortality and morbidity through the CDC, and they just released that last year, starting to put it on the map as one of those major public health initiatives we need to look into. Okay, so if we're all sleep deprived, what does that get us? What does that mean? Well, there's some things we know from basic research that is out there in terms of the effects, and so I just kind of wanted to review them conceptually, and then we can kind of get into trying to build the case of why sleep is a good thing. One is we know that sleep fragmentation or sleep restriction, either way, that insufficient sleep leads to something called a dysregulation in response inhibition. What does that mean in real words? What that means is that if I tell you to go or to not go, let me give you the example. Say go, don't go. If you're tired, you're going to be more likely to go when you're not supposed to go. So you're kind of always going. Okay? So it means that you're going to have a hard time stopping yourself when you're supposed to stop. You just kind of make impulsive decisions. Another thing when you're sleep deprived is that vigilance and attention goes down. There's a strong body of research linking insufficient sleep to car accidents, lots of problems with psychomotor vigilance. In fact, we know they've done comparator studies comparing sleep loss to blood alcohol content, and after I think it's 19 hours, you're at 1.0 BAC in terms of your reaction time, 19 hours awake. So it's a real problem. We know that sleep restriction leads to problems with the way we process emotional information. We know it also leads to impaired glucose metabolism, and this has led to some issues. There's a lot of interesting work in looking at leptin and ghrelin, appetite suppression hormones, appetite regulation hormones, and we've seen that people who are sleep restricted tend to have dysfunctions in those. They're still hungry. So that's one of the reasons that they've started looking at sleep as the third triangle in weight loss programs and other things: exercise, nutrition, sleep. And then finally, we know that sleep restriction leads to a risk of hypertension. So if we look at all these problems, that we're facing in our country and in our culture and maybe even with us, you can kind of see a familiar picture, right? Okay, so I wanted to just focus a little bit on students. This is sponsored by the grad college, and I thought it would be good to just say, okay, well, how does this speak to students? Because students oftentimes are the last ones here because they're like, sleep doesn't matter. What matters are my grades or other things I got going on, right? So what do we know about short sleep in college students? Well, first of all, it's prevalent. We know that it may lead to lower GPA. That there's one study showing that students who are sleep restricted are less able to solve mathematical problems. One of my favorite studies is by a person named Mindy Engel-Friedman, and she did the study asking college students. She sleep deprived them. She had normal students and then kind of ones that are sleep deprived. And by normal, I mean she made them actually sleep a sufficient amount. And what she did is she said, she gave a list of tasks. Would you rather listen to remember you used to have answering machines? Do you want to listen to your answering machine messages? Do you want to watch TV? Versus, do you want to engage in political exchange? Do you want to go to a philosophy group or whatever it is, right? And she found that those students who were sleep deprived chose to listen to their answering machine messages. They avoided choosing any form of task that would be perceived as effortful. I just think that's really interesting from a psychological level too. Drowsy driving, we know that's associated with drowsy driving, especially between 11 and 1 a.m., which I think is interesting, right about the time they'd be going to bed. It's very dangerous for college students to drive about that time, right when bars are closing, or right before that even. It leads to depression, and then also there's some new data out showing that short sleep in college students leads to more binge eating and also negative eating attitudes. All right, so what are some proposed causes? Why do we think college students, I love this picture of the person texting, right, and they can't sleep. First of all, college students have insomnia and sleep disorders. They're young, but that doesn't mean that insomnia isn't prevalent. In fact, 25% prevalence rates. College students have irregular sleep schedules, chronically sleeping in on the weekends, chronically shifting back during the week. Alcohol use is high, caffeine use is high, technology use is high, all of the things that set students up for problems. I love this study I've recently found about texting. So this was just published this year. And they looked at subjective sleep quality and found, and what's interesting is they found that, let me kind of walk you through, the average number of daily texts received, as somebody is texting right now, leads to worse subjective sleep quality. And then when you control for this, let's just put that out of the picture, we found, because this is a hierarchical regression, that just being aware of the fact that you might get notifications at night while you're sleeping, that predicts it above and beyond the number of texts you receive. And then if you control for both of those, above and beyond, you can see that just the compulsion to check for a nighttime notification leads to disruption in sleep, right? So all three of those are, I think they're predicted as like, 25% of the variance in subjective sleep quality. So just important, interesting information about how these phones are changing our lives and our daily routines. Okay, the only cool thing about this is that a lot of these are within our control, right? Our sleep environment is often in our control. There's a little, except for the guy next door that's really loud and has that barking dog, right? But in general, our sleep environment, we can turn off our TVs, we can turn off our phones and our computers. Generally, we can try to figure out how to manage our pets. Some people would argue with me on that one. We can manage our temperature. We can manage the lights. So that's in our control. We can control alcohol, caffeine, in bedtime or rising time. So the control of all of these things is pretty cool from a health promotion or psychological perspective, because it means that potentially we can change. Okay, so time for the group exercise. So I just have to point out, I don't know if you guys read the description, but I love this. Picture of this person, like what we would call Netflix binging, right? Going from one episode to the next episode. You'll see at 4:30 in the morning, it's 4:30, they're eating their nachos, they have their computer out, and where are they sitting? Right in bed, okay? So I kind of wanted to stop here and ask and start and kind of throw out to you all, what is one sleep-based thing that you would like to change? One thing you know. Maybe it's like I need to stop drinking Red Bulls at 7 p.m. I suspect that's it. Maybe for me, maybe it's I need to turn off the TV earlier and not watch that last Netflix episode. Maybe it has to do with, maybe I need to go to bed earlier. I get plenty of sleep, but I'm just not getting in bed. Maybe it means I need to stop falling asleep on the couch and retire to bed earlier. Okay, I think most of you know at least something that you could do. And I'm happy to go through them later, but I want you to think right now. We're going to give you a minute to think about that. And then I'd like you to pull out this sheet that's in front of you.
Just one or?
I just want you to think of one. And we're going to get to the other side in a second. And what I'd like you to do is once you have yours, so let's say for me, it's that I'm not going to watch that second Netflix episode. I'm only going to watch one instead of two, right? Is I want you to go through the pros and cons of continuing to do exactly what you're doing, so maintaining your status quo. So what are the good things for me about going on with Netflix? Well, watching it till, I don't go to 4:30, but watching it till midnight. And then what are the bad things for me about doing that? Okay, and then when you're done with the maintaining status quo piece, I want you to go to changing my sleep behavior. What would happen if I turned off Netflix? What would happen if I put my phone in the other room? What would happen if I actually got into bed when I was sleepy instead of falling asleep on the couch? What would happen if I got up at the same time every day? Or stopped that caffeine use? What are the pros? What are the good things about changing that behavior? And what are some of the things that aren't so good? What are some of the cons? All right, can I ask for just a couple of volunteers on which behavior you're choosing? Yeah.
Getting up at the same time 7 days a week.
Getting up at the same time 7 days a week. I like that behavior. It's a good circadian rhythm behavior. What else? I'm going to call my students, so it's a really good thing to save them. What other ones? What other behaviors?
Don't do any of those things in bed. How you doing?
Yeah, exactly. So but for you, what would that be?
Don't do any of those things in bed.
Don't do any of them in bed. Okay, so get out of bed. If you're going to do them out of bed. Do it on the couch. I like that. That's a great behavior. One more.
Mine is more regulated sleep.
Right.
Going to bed at the same time.
Okay, so finding a consistent schedule.
Twice as good as that guy's.
Yeah. All right. So I like that joke. That's good. Okay. So that's good. So getting more regulated sleep. All of those are good things. Especially I like the waking up, and then sometimes going to bed, especially if you can sleep. You have to be careful about that one, but it's a good one. Okay. So I'm going to talk about mine, and let's come up with what. So here's TV watching for me. Okay. Is what are some pros for me? First thing I came up with is I really like to TV watch, right? It helps me wind down from work. I have a pretty busy work life. I'm always working in the evenings, so it kind of helps me settle in. I look forward to it I have kids, so I look forward to it as an adult-only reward. Like if I want to watch zombies eating up brains, I can do it, right? I'm not saying that I would recommend that show for anybody. And then finally, it's something to share with my husband. We sit on the couch, right? And we enjoy watching TV together and talking about it. Okay? So you see, it's not that simple of a thing to quit, is it? Okay? The other thing for me, there's some cons, is that if I were going to make it, what if my husband went ahead? We'd be off TV series, we'd have separate bedtimes, it's suddenly separating our schedule. Okay? So just some pros and cons. All right, then I thought about changing the behavior. Let's just say I decided to turn the TV off at 10 p.m. every night and actually get in bed and do reading, which I enjoy. Some good things for me is that I might feel healthier, maybe I do some less snacking, I might be more productive at work the next day because I'd actually be rested, maybe I'd be a little less irritable with my coworkers, my husband, my poor students. I might be more patient with my kids, maybe I'd have more time for talking with my husband or reading. And then some cons is that, it's just a lot of work. I have a lot of things going on in my life, and I don't know if I want to make a change right now. It's kind of a pain, right, if I'm really fair about it. Also, sometimes I go to parties, and I really have no clue. I've seen those people that never watched Seinfeld. I'm like, you never watched Seinfeld, you know what I mean? They don't get it. Somehow tapped into pop culture in the same way. And then finally, I'm not sure my husband fits in there. Is he on board with this change? I'm making a change for both of us. You see how this is kind of complicated? And all I'm talking about is turning off the TV. Okay, did you guys have things like that? Yeah? Okay, so now what I want to do is go back and look at your lists. Okay, and let's just say theoretically we were to count up the numbers of pros and cons. Look at my list, lots of pros of maintaining the status quo, pros wins of status quo here, and here, pros wins of changing the behavior. That makes no sense. How do I do both? Right? So I'm an academic. I tend to get in my head, tend to think a lot. And one of the things when I do that is I realize that I can rationalize reasons on either way based on what I feel like doing. I can come up with any number of reasons you want to go there. So a better way of looking at your pros and cons list is looking at the content of whether these are short-term things or long-term things. Okay, so if we're using mine as an example, and then I'm going to do yours, if I look at the pros of maintaining my status quo, of not changing anything, watching, fun, a little bit of a reward. Besides my husband, I would say most of those are just kind of short-term gains, And then the cons of making, this should be the cons of maintaining the status quo, I'm sorry, is that is that separate, maybe being on separate bedtimes, maybe that's not too bad, but it could be more of a longer term issue. Okay, now if we look at the pros, and I apologize that my lines got off a little bit. If we look at the pros of changing my behavior versus the cons of making a change, feeling healthier, is that a long-term thing or short-term thing? Being healthy. Long-term. Being more productive at work, long-term? Less irritable with people. Patient with my kids, reading more. All long-term values, right, that are important to me. Whereas if we go back into cons, again, requires energy, short-term, long-term. Short-term. Last tapped into pop culture, it doesn't matter. Yeah, maybe, but I'm going to tell you that's not as important to me as a person, right? Maybe not as important to my value system. And then there's the husband issue. That could be long-term. That's something I need to sort out, right? So what are you seeing here? Now I want you to look at yours and ask yourself the same question. Circle the things on there that are long-term, the things that mean something to you. And what did you notice? Where are most of your circles? Where are the long term? Yeah, changing sleep. What did you notice it tapped into for you? What values?
For me, I selected getting work done in the morning.
Uh-huh.
As a student, I tend to procrastinate, and then I stay up to get the work done before my deadline.
Yep.
So if I try to do my work in the morning, there are more pros with feeling healthier and being more productive in the day.
That's a great example. Feeling healthier, being more productive in the day. All of those are pros, and it relates to your values versus whatever the other behavior was. Great example, thank you. Okay. All right, so the reason we did this is called a decisional balance, is when we think about decisions in our lives, we have to think about, is the short-term feeling making the decision? Or is it the long-term decision of where I want to be on my trajectory? Okay? And so if we think about sleep, which I personally think is not that easy of a behavior, I can give you as many tips as possible. When we think about sleep and maintaining those tips, we really have to think about what's motivating us. Okay, and that means exploring our values, exploring the things that are important to us. If my husband is never on board with turning off TV at 10, it's going to be a lot harder for me to change that behavior. And my husband and my marriage is a major value to me. Okay, so exploring our values. Okay, so what I'm saying is if we want to start prioritizing sleep, that's one of the things we need to do. Just like, same with any change, by the way. This could be a change with the way we handle our emotions. It can be a change with our eating habits. It can be a change with our work schedule, whatever it is. It's the same thing. Okay, so I just want to talk, here I'm saying is, hey, it's so easy to change, if we kind of think about it. It actually isn't. But I just want to talk about a common obstacle that can occur is once we decide to make that change, once we decide to wake up early and get to work, or I decide I'm going to turn off that TV at 10 p.m., it's gone, right? Here's something that can rear its ugly head, which is the way we're thinking about it. So one of the things I did is last night after writing this talk, I said, I'm going to go home and listen to my advice and make my change. Now that I've done my decisional balance, I'm going to turn off at 10. Well, guess what? 9:45 is rolling around. I'm still on the computer. I'm not ever going to be able to sleep if I don't have a little buffer zone. We'll talk about that. And I noticed myself having this thought, I really should just turn off the TV. I should just do it. There's a problem with that thought, which is it doesn't work. All I do is feel really guilty because I'm not turning off the computer and I kind of want to watch TV. And so then I just say, you know what, I deserve that one TV show, so I'm just going to watch it, even though I know I really should turn it off, right? It's like this vicious cycle. And guilt is a really interesting motivator, by the way. We always use it, but it never is particularly effective. It just makes us feel worse, right? So there's some ways we can kind of address this hurdle as we think about it. And one way is to start recognizing, wait a minute, I'm telling myself something that might not be particularly helpful. Like maybe if I turn off the TV, I'll feel better. Maybe if I get up at the same time every morning, I'll feel more productive. Maybe if I get up early, it's going to be hard, but things will work out. I can't guarantee because I can't see the future. But I know that when I do it, I'll probably be a little bit more proud of myself. So I can turn off the TV and go to bed. We can start to recognize these patterns in our lives and ways to replace them. Another obstacle is the behavior, or the lack thereof, for me, right? So I keep watching I had a tough day, I deserve a break, right? And so I feel tired and depleted, which is part of what started off the feeling that way to begin with, and I continue watching TV. So another option, what if I read a book for fun instead? That could be another way. And what is that going to do? Maybe improve relaxation. And also say things like, wow, I'm glad I finished that book. Hey, that could be something I talk to my friends about instead of zombies, right? Who wants to talk about zombies? Right? So now what I would like you to do is flip over your paper and think about your vicious cycle. Think about a thought or a behavior that stands in your way. If you choose to wake up at the same time every morning, if you choose to make that change you just identified, if you choose to get up early every day, if you choose to regularize your schedule, what does that vicious cycle look for you? How are you going to self-sabotage yourself? What are you going to tell yourself? Think about that should thought. I'm not saying that it's that easy to go in there and just kind of substitute old things with new things, but I think the first step is identifying the vicious cycle for yourself. Because I tend to think that we all know our own situations the best, and once we see them out there, we actually have a chance at changing them and figuring it out. So we've been discussing, when I get into bed, we've been discussing this problem, which is, which is TV, it's watching, it's what we don't like about our schedule, and a lot of it's about not getting enough sleep. When I get into bed, I sleep, I just don't sleep enough. Things aren't working. I want to move on briefly to a different issue, which is I get into bed early, I'm doing fine, I have no problems getting sufficient time in bed, but now I can't sleep. Okay, so this is more of that insomnia problem. And I just want to give you a brief overview of insomnia. How do we define it in Sleepland? It's difficulties initiating, maintaining sleep for 3 months plus daytime consequences. So this is called an insomnia disorder. And one of the things, though, I just want to point out is that all of us at some point in our lives have had insomnia. We all have a night when it's hard to sleep. My 9-year-old daughter just had hers a couple days ago. She's like, why can't I sleep? I'm like, because you can't, your body's not ready. You know, but that doesn't mean she has an insomnia disorder. Okay, insomnia disorder means that it's going on for some time and you're having problems during the day. The general population, we don't exactly know prevalence because we get that symptom and disorder confused a lot, but generally we think it's between 3 to 19% of the population. I wanted to just give a prevalence of college students. The Best City out there is by Dan Taylor, and what he found is that there's a 9.5 prevalence in college, and that means you have all three. You have the daytime complaint, it's severe enough, and he defines severity as pretty good, having 30 minutes to fall asleep or 30 minutes awake in the middle of the night. It's frequent, it happens most nights of the week, at least 3 nights of the week, and it's happened for 3 months or more. And then he found, it's interesting, that additionally 6.5% complained, but they didn't meet all this criteria. And then I thought this was most fascinating, that 27% of college students said, it doesn't bother me at all, but they met all the criteria for insomnia. The only one they didn't meet is the complaint. They didn't think it was a problem. Okay? So just an interesting perspective for whatever reason. How does insomnia develop? Well, like I said, it can happen with any form of precipitating event, but everybody possesses some form of predisposition to, maybe you're low on the predisposition scale or maybe you're a little higher. I tend to find that anxious people or high performers or perfectionists tend to run a little bit higher on the predisposition scale. And then what happens is some precipitating factor or event or something occurs. Maybe there's a breakup or a loss of some form or a job stress or a deadline, and it kind of knocks you over that insomnia line. It becomes chronic insomnia or an insomnia disorder when we start doing things to get rid of the insomnia pattern. So we do things like we go to bed earlier or we start trying to sleep. Okay, we have what we would call compensatory behaviors. And you'll see that over time, even though that original stressor might be there, maybe it's like, I'm giving a talk with cancer tomorrow, maybe that precipitating factor is a really negative medical diagnosis, but even though the medical diagnosis is still there, it's usually the precipitating or the perpetuating factors that keep you going. Okay, how is insomnia thought to work? Well, you guys, I don't know if you remember Pavlov's dog. So Pavlov, there's these dogs, and he gave them a bell, and then he gave them meat powder, and gave them a bell, and then he gave them meat powder, and then he stopped giving meat powder, right? And then he just gave the bell, and what happened to their mouths? They salivated. They wanted that meat powder, right? So what that happened is there was a conditioned arousal associated with the bell. So ironically, the same thing can happen to us in the bed. We toss, we turn, we get upset, we get annoyed, we're frustrated, we text, we watch TV, we look at zombies, we do whatever, I don't do that in bed, but we do whatever we do in bed, right, that to try to sleep, and that becomes associated with the bed. So most of my patients with insomnia, they say that I'm so exhausted, and then I hit the bed and it's like a light bulb goes on. I'm wide awake. And that's again because of the conditioned arousal with the bed. No wonder you have insomnia, you're lying there all night awake. We are our own worst enemies. Okay, so in addition, I just don't want to, we're always talking perpetuating factors, but I just want to mention that stress is a real factor. Stress leads to sleep, but lack of sleep also leads to more stress. This interesting bidirectional relationship. And we look at stress in college students more than ever before. 48% report being overwhelmed within the last 2 weeks. Not using the word stressed, using the word overwhelmed, which is to indicate that I cannot handle my stress. 51% reported above average levels of stress in the last 12 months. Females tend to have with worse sleep quality. Another study found that they have more daytime sleepiness, more perceived stress, more depression, more physical symptoms. So again, stress and sleep quality. I don't know if you guys have heard about this test in China. It's the college entrance exam. Everything for these kids weighs on this test, right? This is the key way that they get to university, is the college entrance exam. And look at that picture. Does that set anybody up for pressure? It's awful, right? And what they did, but it is an interesting model of stress, academic stress, because what they did is they were able to follow these kids over time and kind of get a sample. And they found, if we compared it, that these kids studying for this exam had late bedtimes, and these are all like 16, 17-year-olds. 81% went to bed after 11:30 versus the typical 25 to 30% who still live in the home. They have early wake times. Usually at this age, 6:30 to 7:30 is when kids are waking up, but now they're all waking up early to study before 7 a.m. 65% reported less than 7 hours sleep, 16, 17-year-olds, versus should only be, like our average prevalence rates in the United States are 10 to 32%. And again, 68% required more than 30 minutes to fall asleep. They're all developing insomnia problems, even though they're exhausted. And that compares to our prevalence rates of 14 to 20%. Stress leads to sleep problems. Academic performance with sleep, if you think about prolonged sleep latency, it's interesting. So kids who, this study, more things like, okay, so yeah, it stresses them out, they can't sleep, but what does it do on the test, right? Well, first of all, this is interesting, is that the kids who had a hard time falling asleep, who had that prolonged sleep latency, they actually said, I know I did really bad. But there was actually no difference on the actual scores. It predicted nothing. They're just the ones that are more likely to think they did bad, which we know also leads to what? If you chronically think you're doing something wrong? Depression, yeah. Late bedtime, also this late, okay, so if you're like sitting in the audience and you're a student, you're like, yeah, see, it paid off. Late bedtime payoff. So the idea is, maybe if I stayed up late and studied, is there a short-term payoff? And actually the data suggests there may be. There's absolutely no data suggesting that late bedtime led to poor performance outcomes on the college entrance exam. But we do know that late bedtimes over time can lead to long-term health consequences in adolescents. And then what's really interesting is that the sleep duration was actually unrelated to the score. How much they actually slept didn't do anything. I mean, maybe part of it is because they all slept nothing. So we can't look at the variability. I don't want to say that. It's a little, they all slept less than 7 hours. So, but the point being that, yeah, sleep and stress, absolutely. But maybe sleep and academic performance isn't that bad. Okay, there's not clear links there. Okay, when I threw this in last minute, as soon as I heard this was going out to the community, because I just want to point out that job-related stress and sleep is the same. It's usually a different talk I give this to. But students aren't alone. 40% of people in the United States report that their job is extremely stressful. 25% state job is their #1 stressor. And 75% believe that there's more on-the-job stress than a generation below. We know, there's actually not been enough studies, but we know that workload demand and burnout is associated with increased arousals and polysomnography and also decreased slow-wave sleep. Okay, so we are a changing population. I think we've heard about this on NPR, we've heard about it in the news. We are workhorses. Okay, where does that leave us? Well, I love the way Barry Krakow conceptualizes what he calls the sleep misery cycle, which is the idea is that when we don't sleep enough or we don't sleep good quality sleep, we're tired, we have low energy. And again, going back, we would rather listen to our answering machine messages or watch TV or do things that are completely unproductive than go out there and tackle our problems head on, right? Just doesn't work that way, right? We're tired. So, and one of the things we know in the emotion literature is the more we engage in avoidance, the more negative emotions we're going to have over time, right? That leads to depression, that leads to anxiety, and it starts to make you think questions about chronic, the number of prescriptions for antidepressants in our country, which has risen dramatically, right? More avoidance, more negative emotions, and one of the things we know, sleep stress bidirectional. The more negative emotions, the worse sleep. Okay? So we're gone in here, we can treat our emotions, we can treat avoidance through behavioral therapies, we're just starting to tackle, but maybe we need to start putting sleep in that paradigm as well. Okay, I know we're running out of time. This was just my slide to convince you that one of the best ways to treat sleep is through a therapy called CBT for insomnia. This is a classic study by Charles Morin and JAMA showing that compared to temazepam, a really heavy-duty benzodiazepine used for sleep, diazepine, here's placebo. On the y-axis, we're looking at minutes awake after sleep onset. You can see that everyone here with insomnia is between 15 to 70 minutes that they're requiring. By post-treatment, you can see that the combined therapy does pretty well, but people, and by that I mean that would be people that are still on temazepam and CBTI. But over time, CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy and for insomnia, has a clear advantage over all the, whether it's combination, whether it's temazepam alone, or whether it's placebo, which is a good thing. What's sort of placebo? So CBTI, what do we do to address insomnia in a nutshell? I'm going to give you 3 slides and I think we'll be good. The first thing is stimulus control. Someone mentioned not do those things in bed. I love that. We have to stop that conditioned arousal. We have to unlearn our negative associations between bed and sleep. So bed is only for sleep and sex. If you are lying in bed, awake, ruminating, that counts as something you're doing. You got to get out of bed when you can't sleep, okay? So relearning those associations. If you're not sleepy and you're in bed, that's not a good thing because bed is only for sleep, right? So get out of bed, okay? Sadly, I'm not going to be able to talk about my pitfall slides, even though it's one of the best Atari games ever. All right. Sleep efficiency training. That's the second piece. Okay. So this is something we do. It's good to do with somebody, a provider walking you through it. But what often happens with insomnia is people go to bed about 10. They lay there, oh, I need to fall asleep. It's not working, and they'll sleep a little bit. They get up in the middle of the night. They have to pee, but then they can't get back to bed. Another hour. Finally, they get back to bed. And so they're sleeping a total of 6 hours, although they're in bed trying to sleep for 8 hours, okay? So what we do in sleep efficiency training is we say that's pretty poor sleep efficiency. You're only 75% of the time that you're in bed, you're sleeping. So what we're gonna do is squinch, this is my technical term, squinch your sleep. So what that means is I'm gonna say, since you're only sleeping 6 hours, let's limit your time in bed to 6 hours. So since you generally tend to arise at 6 a.m., then I would like you to go to bed not earlier than midnight in order to effectively compress and restrict your sleep. Okay? And there are rules about how to do that. If you have sleepiness problems, you don't want to just go off and do it yourself, but it's a good thing to do with a coach or a sleep specialist, even better. Okay, circadian rhythm timing. Arise at the consistent time each day regardless of how well you slept. Man, I'm going to tell you that but it's a weekend. It's a really hard barrier to overcome. People feel like they want to sleep in. But the key, right, is long-term versus short-term. We've already thought about that. Okay, finally, okay, so if you've ever been, and we've all been there, in the situation of insomnia, we know what it's like to be like, okay, 2 a.m., okay, 3 a.m., okay, 4 a.m., got to get up at 7, got to get to the airport, or whatever it is, right? So it feels like that. You're just shaken and you're exhausted and you feel like it's meeting the milepost. So the other thing that CBTI does is it really addresses that thought of, I need to sleep so I can rest, right? And I think it's funny because that's what it feels like, right? I need to sleep. But when we're in that feeling state, what's the likelihood of actually sleeping? She's laughing at me. Yeah, someone. All right. Low, right? Yeah. Sleep is one of the few things we just can't force on ourselves. We can work hard at our job, we can work hard at anything, but sleep, you cannot work hard at it. It just doesn't happen that way. You can't, right? In fact, the harder you work, the less likely you are to actually fall asleep. So, looking at that cycle, I need to fall asleep soon so I can get to work, I can do well. It leads to anxiety, it leads to trying to sleep, more time in bed. Instead, saying to ourselves, you know what, my experience tells me that I can function pretty well on a few hours sleep. In fact, the data show that it's not really going to hit my performance, right? We know that from the college entrance exam in China data that we talked about. So then we feel a little less pressured, right? Feel less pressured, what can happen? I get out of bed when I'm unable to sleep, which then maybe leads to our ability to actually increase the likelihood of achieving sleep. More than 3. I'll do this, and then I'm just going to skip to the summary. I think this is really important, and especially important. I told you how I need that wind down time in my TV schedule. A buffer zone is a really important thing, especially when it comes to stress and work. So it's that transition between our goal all day long. We're like, I gotta do this, I gotta do this, I gotta do this. We have all these goal-oriented activities in our work world now. And the key thing about the buffer zone is finding a way. It's almost like when you're on an airplane and they say, I don't know if they say it anymore, but they say, turn off your devices because we're going in for landing. We need to do the same thing when we go to sleep. We need to shut off our devices. We need to stop and have a moment of time with our thoughts before we come to a screeching halt. Imagine if you had a 3-year-old kid and they're running around playing and then you just stick them in bed. What's gonna happen? Everybody's gonna rip their hair out, right? We all need the buffer zone. So the key thing is to remember that whenever we start to get into with our thoughts. Okay, so summary, good quality sleep, important factor in long-term health. Increasing sleep quality involves reassessing our priorities. Okay, you guys all just did that in here briefly. Assessing our associations with bed, reducing our time in bed awake, and then also paying attention to stress in your body. And I always include a baby picture because they're just so cute. All right, thank you for your attention, I appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem.
Yes, let's have some time for some questions. I'm going to bring you a microphone, okay? Thank you.
Would you have any suggestions for those of us who do not have regular, predictable schedules where we can necessarily control what time we get to bed or get up in the morning?
Yeah, I mean, there can be lots of reasons people don't have schedules, predictable schedules, so it's always important to check out with a provider. Okay, so I don't want to give a general tip when it could be a specific medical issue, but I do want to say that one of the most important keys to developing a predictable routine is that early morning light pulse. So getting up in the morning, opening those windows, and getting light at a consistent time can help re-regulate your body. Now, morning is especially important, but the more light you can get throughout the day, the better. And by light, I don't mean these things. Like, guess what the lux is in here, if anyone was going to guess. Like the amount of light that's actually transmitted to our system. Yeah. Well, let me, are you going to answer another question, or? Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
In regard to the light, one of the major things that's happened in our society is computer screens. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, so let me just wrap that into the answer of my last question. So about 250 lux in here. Outside in the sun, we can get up to 10,000 lux. So sunlight is always going to be far superior for our circadian system to time us. Now, your question about computer screens is a really good one, because what happens from computer screens is we get a certain type of light called blue light, and we know that light on the blue spectrum is much more powerful for changing our circadian rhythm. It doesn't matter if we get it at noon, that's not a problem, but when we're on the computers, like I am sometimes, at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, after the sun has gone down, it's helping me, it's confusing my rhythm and saying it's time to stay up later. It's delaying me, just like an adolescent. So a lot of people have screen apps that they can get that actually makes a more warm light, so it doesn't have the same type of power on our circadian system. Now, with that being said, I think there's very little data out there showing exactly how effective all of that is. Yeah.
You work night shifts. Is it possible to get quality sleep during the day?
That's a great question. It's kind of loaded because I kind of want to say no. but I think most people would completely disagree with me. I would say yes, it's possible. If you always wear sunglasses, you're losing light blocker, you go in, you make sure you get no darkness, there's nobody in the house. I just don't see that happening. You know, I work with Tucson Fire Department. People have lives, they have families, they don't live in a bubble.
I used to work nights for a long time.
So you know what I'm talking about.
In my room, make it silent. I lived alone.
Okay, so you were able to.
I wouldn't get long-term sleep.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, night shift work, we have seen that just after 2 years of night shift work, so many health problems. Night shift work, our bodies are just not set up for it. But that being said, I think it is possible, and what you're describing is the ideal situation. The other thing that happens is a lot of times people in night shift want to go back to regular during the weekend so they can be with the rest of the world, you know? And that's really bad in our system, constantly switching. Yeah, question. Mm-hmm.
More particularly for the people who are working night shift,
Yeah.
when they're out at night and then they're inside and making it night essentially.
Yeah.
They don't receive hardly any of that lux
Yeah.
that you were talking about.
You can get it through light boxes. In some companies, you can get light boxes, but it has to be prescription strength. And a lot of companies that have night shift workers have made accommodations. You can get industrial hygiene in. But you're right, if you have low light all night and you're working, then, I mean, the good thing is your circadian rhythm isn't as kind of switched, but the bad thing is you're going to be chronically kind of confused on which time you're getting, right? So you never really switch to a night shift.
So would those lights actually correct that?
Lights would correct it if your goal is to be on a night shift 24/7, right? Which includes weekend. Yeah, lights would certainly help. Yeah, question.
Just one more thing about that. I was worried about the long-term effects. My dad's done night shift for 25 years, and he's going to retire soon. So I was just worried about like the long-term effects of having that type of cycle, because he does switch.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to like scare you. It's hard to answer that. I will tell you that 10 years or longer of night shift work has been associated with some pretty negative outcomes. But that being said, we know that there is individual resiliency. Some people are just genetically timed to handle it well. Some people are not genetically advantaged. That's all in the last 2 years of sleep research. It's trying to match the people that can be resilient and pop back and the people that haven't. I have found, I mean, there's no data to support this, but having worked in hospitals, that the people on night shifts generally seem to like the night shifts. They tend to feel comfortable and better with it. I don't exactly know why. But I think it's, and the other thing we know is that just because you like it doesn't mean that you have that gene, so that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But we do know that there's individual variation. Yeah. One last question? Yeah. Or two? Yeah.
More of a comment. Having started way back, a lifetime ago, my pediatric residency, and it was innate in me. I had to literally go outdoors and get sunlight, and then I could start forgetting.
Yeah.
Even though I may have been up 24 hours, I had to start with light.
Yeah, you need light. I know it's amazing how much you miss it. And then, yeah, and you can imagine, you hear about all these kind of crazy things that happen in northern latitudes with people who have day all the time or no day at all. You know, again, we're not wired that way at all. I think there was, I don't know. I'm fine with staying. I think this gentleman over, do you want to?
One more.
Okay, that sounds good.
I don't know if anybody saw last night, it was Charlie Rose and Mariana Huffington, and so what I'm looking at is what can we do for continued public health. They were somewhat bragging about their 4 to 5 hours of sleep that they get a night, and then they do, Charlie does 2 half-hour naps, and power naps, he says, and his health is great. I'm not sure that's a really healthy thing to do,
Yeah.
but you can comment.
Well, I think that's, having worked in the military with VA, having worked with firefighters, there's certainly, it's like a badge of duty, like, hey, I don't need sleep, But then I look at the reports for the number of fire engines that have accidentally hit a car, or the military guys are like, they're up all the time. They're making very complex and complicated decisions. And that does not mean that they cannot do it, but everybody has injuries and makes mistakes. So I would say that, again, there's individual resiliency, but I do think it's a problem that we're putting a badge on a lack of sleep and almost an expectation as a culture. Because that's not, I actually think that's a really big problem. But unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure how to change that around. So thank you. Again, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's give her a big hand.